Good morning, Tobago.
Good morning, and welcome to Good Morning Tobago right here on Tobago Updates. This morning, we're talking more about politics and what's happening here in Tobago. This morning, I have the pleasure and the privilege of sitting in studio with Mr. Max James. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning to you.
It's always a pleasure to have these discussions. So, you have been paying attention to the political scene here in Tobago, and you've had a number of comments in the past, but of recently, you made a statement that said democracy in Tobago is in peril. Explain that to us. Why do you say that?
Well, it's a theme that we will have to develop to its fullest meaning and proportions. And it has become a very topical issue, having regard to the fact Tobago's history since the reformation or the re-establishment of the Tobago House of Assembly. From since that time, and the history is there for all to see, but it is becoming more and more excruciatingly painful under this particular administration because of the troubles they have seen. But for the student outside there, even the elementary school student, I want to urge them to go back and read the history of Tobago's democratic development since 1976, 1977. It's interesting to know that even from that time, although the motion for Tobago's self-development or Tobago's self-determination was moved by Ian Robinson / Winston Murray, the PNM even at that stage felt that they should take the glory and the fame for it, that haven't done anything, but having to take the fame and the glory from since then, and said that it was Kamaluddin Mohammed that moved the motion. All they did was to rewrite the motion in the House, because at the end of the day, it's the government that has to carry the motion, even though raised by an opposition member of the House. So they wanted to take credit for it. And we have a long history of interference. Guns in Kingsby, I believe in Robinson Road, tried to interfere with his freedom. We have had, and anyone can check it, as I said. We have, let me look at my notes here. We have the Carlos John incident, where they tried to come to Tobago, usurping the functions of the assembly to come here and pave roads. We have Eric Williams saying Tobago will eat grass after he lost the 2 Tobago seats. We had Patrick Manning. We had underfunding of Tobago. We had under Orville London 16 years where the needle did not move in terms of having a better legal framework for self-determination here in Tobago. We have, as I said, 16 years of PNM rule, and nothing has moved. We have understaffing of the various divisions of the assembly. Since in my time when I was a secretary, in those days it was under the UNC. However, it's still a Trinidad-centric approach to how Tobago should prosecute its own affairs. So you had under Morgan Job and Basdio Pandey and Kamla Prasad Bissessa, all of them, they took an excruciatingly long time to approve the staffing requirements of Tobago. And that was on that basis and for that reason that we had that significant employment of officers and contract in the assembly, because the staffing needs of Tobago weren't seen as important. Remember, we just had an act passed 1996, and it required new divisions, and of course, more divisions meant more staffing, and preferably under the DPA or the Service Commission. All right. Of particular importance is what has happened since I think last week or 2 weeks ago, where you had the home of a sitting secretary being raided on what the public is beginning to realize very flimsy or for no reason. So when you add it all up, where you see representatives of the people, our homes are raided, they are being belittled, or there's a significant attempt to belittle them from the chief secretary down, his wife, his family, the deputy chief secretary, other secretaries, assistant secretaries, even the employees of the Tobago House Assembly. You see it's an assault on Tobago in the management of its affairs. So that when those things happen, it affects our representatives from carrying out their work democratically affected, and they're stultifying their ability to work on behalf of the people of Tobago. Hence, I would have made the statement that democracy in Tobago is in peril.
Right, and even the situation that took place with the sitting assemblyman in regards to the licensing officers coming and execute a search warrant at his home, along with officers from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. What do you think this says for the relationship between Trinidad and Tobago? Specifically when the licensing office is supposed to be under the remit of this assemblyman's
Remit.
division.
And let me speak to that quickly. I listened to Mr. Ansel Dennis, former chief secretary, and it is the illogic, or to use a phrase from one of my brothers, the careless logic, when he says publicly that we are relying here in Tobago on a few lines under the fifth schedule to determine how Tobago should run its business. And the few lines as he's referring to is where it says licensing is a matter under the fifth schedule for which Tobago is responsible. It amazes me of that, let me repeat it for emphasis, of the careless logic of Mr. Ansel Dennis, a former chief secretary, where he can say, or he can berate the fact that the few lines that he's referring to that gives us the power of to prosecute licensing operations and matters in Tobago. It is the same thing he relied on. But you see, it's a P&M kind of thinking where even though it's in place in the legislation, he, succeeding from Orville, London, gave back a lot of the responsibilities to Trinidad, to the central government, as we see, in almost every arena, every area of our responsibilities. A minister will now have to approve town country planning, licensing, some matters of finance, and the list goes on, where they have not seen the importance of developing Tobago's democracy, where they ceded back the responsibility, for which a few lines Ansel Dennis is talking about, to Trinidad, or back to the Prime Minister and back to cabinet ministers. And they will have to answer, because those are the facts, why they did not prosecute Tobago's democracy in the way that they should.
How does statements like this one made by the former Chief Secretary Ansel Dennis, how does it affect Tobago's thrust towards autonomy?
Well, if you don't recognize what you have, if you don't recognize the power and authority that you have, and you reduce it to saying publicly that there's only a few lines there, and ostensibly those few lines don't mean anything, because the P&M is on record from since the days of Orville, London, to Ansel Dennis, to Kelvin Charles, that Tobago's authority is of little consequence. Now, this former chief secretary, he almost on a daily basis attacks the Secretary of Works, somebody who the record has shown to be a stellar performer. Perhaps when they wake up in the morning, they hear his name, they are literally weak at the knees and are afraid because of the performance. This very person, leader of the P&M in Tobago, is on public record of saying, when he went into the assembly, he said, quote, "I didn't come into the assembly to be poor." He said so. It's on Hansard. I didn't come in the assembly to be poor. In other words, leaving his job in FCB, where he once worked, Community Assembly, he had no desire to be a poor man. So I want him. He has been on a daily record accusing Trevor James of being corrupt. I want to put Anthony Dennis to the challenge, to the test. Is he willing to take an FBI supervised lie detector, assuming it was possible? I want Ansel Dennis to submit himself to an FBI approved lie detector, and they will ask him all the pertinent questions. And then I will know that he's not a poor man.
Do you think under the leadership of Ansel Dennis, the Tobago PNM is interested in autonomy?
Repeat, sorry.
Do you think under the leadership of Ansel Dennis that the Tobago Council of the PNM is interested in Tobago's autonomy?
If they were interested, he would have gotten Mrs. Shamfa Kojo. Forgive me, Miss Kojo, I don't know her married name.
Lewis.
Would have had Ina Webster Roy, and all of them, to ensure that the Prime Minister, who ultimately the power to move this thing along resides, and say, listen, the bill that you have stalled in the Parliament is not what we want, and we are going to support for stronger legislation that gives Tobago true self-determination. And they have all failed, and they're playing politics with Tobago's future, Tobago's democratic development, because a lot of the matters for which ministers still come across here to do, particularly town country planning. We have plans from Tobagonians who are damned at the coastline, so to speak, because somebody in Trinidad will not approve it. When we were power under the leadership of Future Charles deceased, God bless his soul, town country, we didn't, and I want to urge Mr. Augustine to do the same. We didn't approach Trinidad as if we didn't know that it was a matter under the fifth schedule. We put in place a town planner. We approved plans right here without reference to anybody in Trinidad. And I think it's a golden opportunity for him to do so, and to do so with a greater degree of expedition. I think that even the issue of licensing, I heard Mr. Kelvin Morris on TV6 this morning, and where he says that people must be surprised. You don't have to surprise anybody in Tobago in terms of traffic violations or anything, because you could have simply dealt with that in a different way. So he's relying on the element of surprise, and it's a very misplaced logic again. The fact of the matter is that if it is that licensing, as it is, a matter under the fifth schedule, for 16 years, plus 1 year or 2 years of Ansel Dennis thereabout, they had the duty and the authority to put the staffing arrangements in place for the division of licensing. Let me repeat that. It is a matter under the fifth schedule. So if you don't have enough licensing officers, you employ more, or you put them on contract and you have a conversation with the transport commissioner.
Do you think that is something that can be done by the current secretary?
Well, I think if he hasn't woken up, this should wake him up, in the sense that he and the administrator must recognize that it is their role and their responsibility, and the chief secretary has to give the okay. So I think it's a golden opportunity now to ensure that the licensing division is fully staffed, and they should not wait on any transport commissioner. It has not worked. So maybe they were waiting on the transport commissioner. And I'm saying that it is in their remit, the law says so. Let me explain that even better. Act number 8, I think, and 79 of 1988, I think I got the year correct, says, and changing the definition of a public officer and giving it a new definition, one in the service of the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and the other under the Tobago House of Assembly. So what that means, the Tobago House of Assembly has its own public service. Gone should be the days where they are now under Orville, they are now trying to make it one public service But with the advent of Act number 40, it gave Tobago its own public service. So I see over the years, they are sending persons to be going to Trinidad, acting as deputy permanent secretaries and all of that, when we could develop the systems here for ourselves, because people have this idea that going to Trinidad is better and you have more opportunity, not understanding that you can develop the systems here for ourselves, our own public service. If we recognize that, we would not have white shirts coming to Tobago because we would have been fully staffed. So if they understand, and I want to urge the Chief Secretary again, if Chief Secretary, you have to understand that the division belongs to you and you must staff the division. If you staff the division, putting in place your own white shirts here, then you won't have any white shirts coming from Trinidad. And you don't have to surprise anybody because routinely they'll be doing the inspections on a daily basis. So nobody, according to Kelvin Morris, you have to surprise somebody on the road because we'd have been fully staffed or having our own white shirts here, still operating under the rules that the Transport Commissioner ultimately has responsibility. But removing that gradually, where we put in place again, ad nauseum, our own white shirts, our own systems here as the law mandates us to do.
Understood. We're going to take a quick break right here and we're going to be back right after this. See you soon.
It's a brand new morning, rise up to a brand new. Let's go. It's a brand new morning, rise up to a brand new.
Good morning, and welcome back to Good Morning Tobago right here on Tobago Updates. We continue our conversations on all things happening in the political arena right here in Tobago, as I am in studio chatting with Mr. Max James. Good morning and welcome back.
Yes.
So before we took off for the break, you were talking about licensing being under the remit of the THA, in addition to a number of other areas such as tongue and country planning, and that there are moves that need to be made by this administration to really take control over those elements. What do you recommend should be the next steps going forward for this administration in really, taking control of those things that are under their remit?
So let me develop on that just a little bit more. When I was the cooperative secretary, I was cooperatives, labor cooperatives and consumer affairs. But let's deal more specifically with cooperatives. So let me show them how it can be done. The law gave me as a secretary responsibility for cooperative development, but you had a commission of cooperatives in Trinidad. I simply called him. I said, listen, let's have a conversation. And I told him bluntly, I will be having my own stamp and I've been having a director of cooperative development. And I expect you to support this measure because there are some other legal issues that would vested issues that you will have to deal with. But I expect your full cooperation. He understood. And he said, okay, Mr. James, I directed my administrator to have our own stamp. I put in place a whole new division for cooperative development to do the research and all those things that pertain to corporate development. And we will talk from time to time directly or through the administrator, because the law says that cooperatives is a matter for the fifth schedule. If you want to take me to court, fine, I'll just pull the law on you. And if you want to go, and we go to the Privy Council. But you have to show the people, and I urge the Chief Secretary again to understand that, and his team. It is just as how there's a Secretary of Health, but you have a health minister, and you have all the health regulations and all the health acts and laws and all of that. The same thing goes for almost every other area. You have a concurring or a parallel minister in Trinidad with the same laws of this country. But town and country goes to our economic development. It speaks to our economic development. And if we don't fix that, it means somebody in Trinidad will tell us how to develop our land resources here in Tobago and affect people from investing, building their houses the way they want, agricultural land development, industrial land development, commercial land development, as the case may be, where should build. All those things we took under wing immediately. And there was nothing Trinidad could have done. Nothing.
Right.
We put in place a land planner and she approved the plans. Those plans went from that office to the planning division. I think it was headed by Mr. Elton Bob at the time, Dr. Elton Bob at the time. And we just moved to do those things. So when people in those days heard the names of deceased Carl Dick and Cecil Carruth and Hochoy Charles and Max James, they knew that we were coming. We were given a mandate from the people to fix that. And we can't afford to let time run out and those things aren't fixed.
I'm glad that you
Orville took
brought up
16
the
years and he never did anything about it. Until then, it's a year and a half, nothing done about it. Kelvin Charles, what is going on?
I'm glad that you brought up the idea of time, because this administration has almost, let's just say, a year and a couple months in office. Do you think this is the right time for such a move? And do you think it's possible to do this before the next election?
The town country planner can be done now. The licensing officers might be a slightly different challenge, but it also can be done with the proper conversations. Now, if you tell the Prime Minister at meetings, if he ever agrees to meet, or you go to a chief administrator here who has powers to employ people temporarily, I think up to 6 months, and then it goes beyond 6 months, then other measures have to. But you want to have a conversation to create the positions if they don't exist. So you have to create them. PNM didn't do it. So you have a golden opportunity now to do it. So we're going to create the positions, either public service positions or on contract. Whatever is going to work, let us begin the process. If the PNM disapproves of it or doesn't support it, we tell the people, here, these are the things that we want to do. And the Prime Minister, the Transport Commissioner, the Minister of Works and Transport in Trinidad, they are preventing us from proceeding and from developing our democracy and our systems here in Tobago. So I don't see how they're going to win that political battle, but you have to start the process and go to the people and say, these are the things that we are doing. These are our efforts to prevent the white shirts from coming to Tobago.
I remember in a previous conversation that you and I had, you indicated that you were going to launch a union for industrial relations here in Tobago. How has that been going, and is that still on the table for you?
It's still on the table. It might happen, most likely happen this year. Dr. Winston Murray asked me to do it. I have his certificate. It's called the Tobago, it's Tobago Labour Party, I think it is. Labour Union, something like that. I haven't looked at it recently. But I think it is important, if you remember, or you might have heard over the weekend, I think it is former president of the Industrial Court, Shenell Felix, would have come out with a new book, I think 513 pages, You're Fired. The idea is that it seems to me that all administrations, all are anti-worker in some form or fashion. They are not recognizing that the workforce is your greatest resource. And there are some persons in all administrations who are bent on either taking revenge because a former administration did that to them. You are seeing evidence where the laws of this country, people speak things of which they don't know, and they have lawyers to back them up because those lawyers want money and they wouldn't tell them the truth. So you've seen evidence where workers are disenfranchised of their rights. And I think that this administration has a responsibility to ensure that workers' rights are in fact supported and defended. This chief secretary said on one of his platforms, pre-office, a worker should not have to fight for something he or she is entitled to. And therefore, that principle as a principle I have learned since I was a trade union officer. So it's going to come because I think workers generally in Trinidad and Tobago need better representation. They need to have their rights defended according to the law and according to the rules and regulations that govern their contract of employment. When I say contract of employment, I don't mean contract workers. Workers who are in the public service or under the commission, they're all on contract too. It's a different contract, but they're all on contract. Just as you have persons who are brought in on what you call contract employment. It's a very loose term, and a lot of people don't understand it. So contract officers said, well, they're nothing, we're not going to give them instructions, or they can't give me any instructions. They're all in the chain of command, and there's something called the test of an employee, or it's called the control test, or the organizational test. And once the answers in respect of questions that pertain to people's employment, the answer is yes. In other words, is this person in the chain of command? The answer is yes. Assuming you're my employer, do you pay both of us? The answer is yes. Do you give daily instructions that both of us must follow? The answer is yes. Can you discipline all of us? The answer is yes. The terms and conditions of employment, are they determined by the employer? The answer is yes. So then you have an employee. So that's the control test. The organization test is where the questions will be asked. Are you part of this organization? Are you subject to the rules and dictates and organizational decisions of the organization? Sorry. And if the answer is yes, then you will be deemed to have passed the organization test. So both contract officers and public officers, there's very little difference between them. It's just that one has a finite term of office, so to speak, and the other until they're 60 or 65, as the case may be. So they're all employees. So contract officers can give public officers instruction and vice versa. And it's not to be confused. And there's this continuing nonsense where you hear even secretaries saying it, that, well, the contract came to an end and the law says nonsense. There are several persons in the assembly who want matters like that. If you're not going to renew my contract, you have to give me significant notice before. And you must have a reason not to renew the contract. The only reason, there are two reasons: redundancy, or you're closing down an entire unit, or the employee in his former term of employment would have done things that went to the root of his contract. So the governments all over the time, all over the place, have not practiced good performance management. So if they practice good performance management and have a solid and sound appraisal system, you will know that is what protects the employer and protects the employee. And if an employee has a good performance appraisal result or test, then you cannot or not to renew the person's contract. And therefore you have to have, the secretaries must know that and accept that regardless of what they think. Supervisors must understand that regardless of what they think. They must make the necessary recommendations and have the proper performance appraisals in place under a proper human resource management system and a proper human succession system. Those are critical functions of any employer, including the Tobago House of Assembly and, as we say, central government. Those things must be practiced so that you reduce the incidence of where workers feel that they are not treated properly. Remember, at the end of the day, they have to vote for you, and that you have to think about that. But you want industrial peace, because with industrial peace, let me make that this point, with industrial peace in the workplace, you have greater productivity, and your democracy is protected because it's a democratic system. But under a democratic system, we have these systems of performance management and performance appraisals and all the rest of those nice things. Those things are the underpinnings of our democracy. And if those things don't function well and people are aggrieved, then your democracy is in peril.
Understood. We're going to take a quick break here and we're going to continue our conversation right after this. See you soon.
It's a brand new morning, rise up.
Morning and welcome back to Good Morning Tobago right here on Tobago Updates. This morning, as we wrap up our conversation, we are touching a bit on crime and the transfer of the two most senior police officers here in Tobago. We have the Acting Commissioner of Police, Collis Hazel, as well as Senior Superintendent Roadhill Kirk, and they have both been transferred to Trinidad. Just tying it back into that whole situation that took place with the licensing officers coming to Tobago, how do you think that this, reflects the type of relationship that Tobago has with Trinidad, where officers are pulled out because of quote unquote non-performance and the high rates of crime and criminality on the island, when the rates of criminality in Trinidad and Tobago on a whole, specifically Trinidad, has not reduced at all when we compare 2023 to 2024?
Before I answer you, let me just correct something I said. Until then, it's worked at Republic Bank and not FCB. So
Okay.
I just got that correction from a former banker. Anyhow, so Republic Bank, all right. And in terms of the officers from Trinidad, the licensing officers, again to repeat, to really make that point very pellucid, the chief administrator, after consultations with, of course, the chief secretary, and the other consultations they'll make with the other the counterparts in Trinidad, can determine the levels of licensing officers we need in Tobago. A lot of time we see about a dozen of them. So we could clearly say we want a dozen more officers. What is the route to that? It can be through the Public Service Commission, or it can be on contract, perhaps, and we deal with those things, but the post can be created. There might be an existing organizational chart. We need to look into that. But whatever it takes, we need to have the requisite levels of licensing officers in Tobago, homegrown licensing officers preferably, because it speaks to the knowledge of our people and our culture. So to go directly to the question of whether officers from Tobago should be transferred, I think it's a misplaced logic that you're going to transfer your officers, your homegrown officers. Whether you like them or not is not the issue. I know both officers well enough. And not everything that Mr. Hazy did I liked. Not everything Mr. Cook did I liked. What are you going to say to the officers in Grenada? Grenada is in a few square miles larger than Tobago, Barbados as well. Tobago is larger than St. Kitts Nevis. Tobago is larger than Antigua, or thereabouts, the same size. Are you going to transfer your officers out? Some people say, well, Tobago and Trinidad is one country. But everybody in Antigua knows each other, not so. And for the most part in Grenada and Barbados, arguably too. So what are you going to say? Bring officers from England? Something speaks to that kind of logic. It's absolutely logical to be saying I will transfer officers to Tobago because they're not performing. There are systems to do that. There are measurable systems to deal with people's performance. So transferring it doesn't transfer. You're transferring and bringing another problem. Who says that the officers from Trinidad are better than Mr. Hayes or Mr. Cook?
But then the question arises, are Tobago officers being transferred to Trinidad to assist with the crime fighting situation when it is deemed that those that are at the head of the police service in Trinidad are not performing? Is the same measure of influence?
There are a lot of corrupt officers in Tobago and in Trinidad. The police commissioner has to put systems in place to deal with those things. The Minister of National Security has to put systems in place to deal with those things with the corrupt cops. All right? Mm-hmm. And therein lies the problem. The people who we claim or at at the top of the economic ladder in Trinidad and Tobago, how the drugs come into the country, how the guns come into the country. What are the measures? Have they taken any significant measures to protect our southern and northwestern border between Venezuela and Trinidad? Why aren't our Coast Guard boats not functioning? You transfer Kirk for that or Hazel for that? Doesn't make sense. We should be happy to have them here because they should know the turf. To say that if you transfer them and you bring fresh people, if we take the argument and extrapolate the argument, do we know the officers are coming? We know their track record. Do we know that they aren't corrupt? If they aren't corrupt, or if they're whatever it's the case with them, we might even bring somebody corrupt to Tobago, or more corrupt to Tobago. We don't
had
know.
The leader of the IDA coming out and saying that fresh leadership alone would not solve Tobago's crime problem, which is a multi-layered challenge that we're facing. Do you agree with the statement?
Of course, I agree with this statement. As I have always argued, our social services ministry and division is perhaps the most important division or ministry in the country. It speaks of family development or family values or societal values. And if we begin to embed or re-embed that into our students, into our homes, everybody wants a kickback. Everybody wants a gun. Everybody wants to steal. And if I see you stealing and I talk about it, then I'm now persona non grata. It has to do with societal values. And if we fix the social values and the family values, we're going to have less and lesser crime in the country. Somebody will kill you for $5,000 or for $2,000 and without batting an eye. Since when that can be so? So we have to fix the psychology, and you could only fix the psychology by having perhaps the church playing a greater role in people's development. But I think you're not going to solve it if you don't fix the home. What do we teach our children? What did mother say when somebody got killed? And he was a good boy. I never know that man was in thing. I didn't even know she was in thing. And so it going. When you see people with all these gold chains and all these, or so-called gold chains and it's what they call the bling, where they get the money from? They're not working. So we need to have politicians in Trinidad and Tobago submit themselves to lie detector tests.
All right.
I'm going back to that. And I want, because until Dennis has the penchant for saying people are corrupt, I want him, as we close the show, I want him to submit himself to a lie detector test and hear, see all. And not only him, a lot of the people in the PNM that talk this nonsense about who is corrupt in this present administration, let them take a lie and they will know the real sources of income and revenue and all of that, where they get their riches from, the nice vehicles that they used to hide in the garage and they can't bring it out and so on. All those and the houses and land that they have, let them submit themselves to a lie detector test and we'll know who is who. And they'll stop spewing the nonsense that they're spewing regarding this administration.
All right. Thank you so much, Max James, for coming in this morning and giving us your perspectives on how this administration can go about taking charge of matters that are under the 5th schedule. Thank you so much. Guys, we want to thank you so much for being a part of this morning's discussion. Thank you for your likes, your shares, and your comments. And thank you for continuing to assist us in having a vibrant discussion. Thank you as well for all that you have been doing to make Tobago Updates the #1 broadcaster here on the island of Tobago. Again, have a great day. Thank you.
It's a brand new morning, rise up to a brand new dawn.